Chapter 2. Safire, age 14, November. Dagmar and I sat with our tutor Lawrence, a fallen monk whom Father jested at one point had reformed from chastity. That remark had earned him a frosty glance from Mother and several questions from me, questions Mother had crisply put off with the unsatisfactory answer, "You'll understand when you're older, Safire." I had assumed she meant she would reveal all when I had my first bleeding. But the only mystery that momentous event cleared up was that being a woman did indeed hurt in peculiar ways. Because of the farm animals and their courtship rituals, I already knew that girls and boys were different, differences which only widened the gulf between them until adulthood, when an unchaste man could frolic about the countryside with impunity, while an unchaste woman got called all kinds of unmentionable names and died of unmentionable disease in a gutter somewhere. The scandal in our tutor's past had made his wages cheap enough for my father to afford him and made my mother keep an eagle eye on him during the first several months of his tenure. However, his behavior towards me and Dagmar was always impeccably dull, so Mother soon trusted him to instruct us without her watching as long as the schoolroom door stayed open at all times. Lawrence pointed at 2 triangles he had drawn on his slate. "Identify these and how they're different," he said, his liquid tenor voice caressing each syllable. He was an anemic, twitchy sort, so edgy his yellowish aura buzzed like a swarm of bees. That was until he opened his mouth. Then I could understand why the monastery had made him a cantor at Mass, why some woman had risked her virtue for him. He had tried to teach Dagmar and me to sing, but had despaired at our lack of musical talent. The sides of an equilateral triangle are all the same length, whereas only 2 sides of an isosceles triangle are the same length, I said, pointing at each triangle as I spoke about it. I liked geometry. It was as close as I could get to sketching in the schoolroom. Dagmar hid a smile behind her slate, and Lawrence chuckled thinly. "What?" I demanded. "I'm right, aren't I?" "You are correct, but it's pronounced isosceles, Lady Safire, not isosceles." "Oh. Isosceles," I repeated, to make certain I said it properly this time. "I've only read about it, not heard it spoken out loud before." I rested my chin on my palm and looked glumly out the window at a flock of geese flying across the steel-gray sky. An hour and a half of lessons to go. Sarns was next, and I hated Sarns. Such an ugly language, full of punctuation pitfalls for the unwary. Father poked his head through the doorway, startling us all. He crept about the house with uncustomary silence. He barely spoke anymore, which made meals miserable affairs, with Mother's chair so empty at one end of the table and Father a living ghost of himself at the other. Dagmar and I had racked our brains to think of ways to cheer him up, but nothing came to mind. Not surprising, as we couldn't even cheer ourselves up. We had never suffered grief of this magnitude. Aside from Grandmama's passing, which had happened when we were both too young to understand death very well, our only experience of grief had been the funerals of our mostly nameless infant brothers and sisters and the inevitable butchering of pigs and steers we had been foolish enough to make pets. "Sir Avenel, can I assist you?" Lawrence asked after a long moment of uncomfortable silence while we waited for Father to speak. "Lessons are over for the day," Father announced abruptly. "Girls, come with me." "Yes, sir." Lawrence snapped his geometry book shut while Dagmar and I rose and followed Father to his study, a small chamber with an ancient desk and rack of pigeonholes in the corner and several chairs scattered across the floor, random as a giant game of jacks. My eyes flicked idly over the piles of leather-bound volumes and pamphlets. I couldn't help but look at books, though I already knew any printed material in here related to farming. Father was very practical. Then my gaze lit on a stack of crimson and blue books on his desk, and I paused before I sat down on the chair beside Dagmar. The gold-embossed title of the top book was Comedy by Candlelight. That didn't sound like a farming treatise. Father shut the door. Then he settled in his desk chair with a creak, leaning toward us, his elbows propped on his knees, his hands dangling limply. "All right, girls," he started, then stopped. I noticed, with no small shock, that his eyes appeared varnished, a suspicious gleam of tears. Then he sniffed loudly his orange aura flaring and flickering just like a candle flame in a draft, and I knew for certain then that he had been crying. Poor father. I wanted to embrace him, but knew that would likely make him break down completely. All right, he started again. I never expected to have to talk to you about the estate. Women should be preserved from such business as much as possible. But now it's fairly certain that you will never have a brother. He trailed off and exhaled loudly before he continued, his voice unsteady. You will never have a brother to handle it for you. I wouldn't feel right until we discussed it. If something happens to me— Father, no, Dagmar exclaimed. Just let me finish, sweet. I intend to be around for a good while yet, but in case something happens, I want you to be prepared. The estate provides only a modest living now, to be sure, but the only reason that's the case is because I lack the resources to invest properly in the land. If I had the money, I'd drain the swamp and take advantage of the natural harbor we own at the northern tip of the property. Now, you'll both soon be of an age for marriage, and even though we don't have much coin, the promise of our lands, the lands I intend to divide between you, should be enough to secure well-born husbands for you both. If something happens to me and you're left on your own to contract your betrothals, for God's sake, don't fall into the trap of some silver-tongued peasant fortune hunter. We may be Sparrow nobility, but we're still an old family, as old as the Landers and Sumners. There's enough coin for you to go to court and find proper husbands if for some reason I can't find one for you. He went on like this for some time, finally ending by telling Dagmar to continue to watch out for me as well as she always had. I bit my tongue and looked at my feet as he said this. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate Dagmar's guidance. I did. But she didn't know everything, and it had dawned on me soon after I could talk that we were very different, and what worked for her might not work for me. When I saw a soft summer rain, I wanted to dance barefoot in it, and Dagmar wanted to stay sensibly inside. Two perfectly fine approaches, in my opinion, so why did I always get into trouble and she never did? Now, Father reached for a large lidded basket behind him. Someone had painted a lovely daisy chain around the edge of the lid. Good Lord, I'd kill for some paints, all those colors at my fingertips. Dagmar, Father was saying, and I yanked myself back to reality. As you know, this was your mother's. I thought with your talent for needlework, you should have it. Dagmar's arms closed around the basket as she set it on her knees, hugging it to her as if it were our mother herself. Thank you, Father, she said quickly, gulping. Now, sweetling, Father said, using his favorite endearment for me. These books are for you. He lifted the tottering stack on his desk and carefully deposited it in my lap. You love fairy stories and such, and your mother would have wanted you to have them. I certainly won't read them, and I doubt Dagmar will. Dagmar shook her head as she dabbed at her eyes and nose with her handkerchief. I mutely rose and set the books on the chair so that I could put my arms around him. He embraced me back, and I could smell the rich dark of earth on him from where he'd been out inspecting the vegetable garden earlier as the men laid it to rest for the winter. Dagmar and I took our new treasures back to our bedchambers to savor them in private. I sat cross-legged on my bed and picked up the first book on the stack, the Comedy by Candlelight title. Hayden Sirach. I'd never heard of that writer before. I thought our tutor had been very thorough, teaching us Cormoran literature, especially my favorite Legat, but apparently Lawrence had missed one. Soon, my cheeks burning, I knew why Lawrence had skipped this particular author. I slammed the book shut as if I discovered a colony of stinging ants nesting betwixt its pages. Stinging ants, though, would have horrified me, and what I felt now was not horror, but some other intense emotion that I couldn't identify. A strange hot tingling in my blood that settled deep in my belly. Wicked, wicked book. Had Mother really read this? Someone had read it. The pages were well thumbed, even dog-eared in a couple spots. Certainly Father hadn't read it, or he would never have given it to me. Never, never. Slowly, I eased it open again. Wicked it might be, but I had to know. Would the naughty goose girl really let the swineherd seduce her? Or would she have a fit of maidenly virtue at the last minute? I sort of hoped she wouldn't. That pasture with its sweet smell of clover baking under the high summer sun, the daisies nodding and winking between the blades of grass, the honey taste of his lips. How could she resist? I couldn't. I knew it. I clapped my hand to my mouth, my eyes widening in sudden realization. I wanted some man to kiss me just like the swineherd kissed the goose girl, some man to seduce me in a pasture. What kind of wicked girl was I? I went to dinner, heavy with a shameful self-knowledge and desire for a honey-lipped swineherd, just the kind of peasant Father didn't want me to marry. For once, I was glad he didn't talk during meals anymore.